Now that poet-theorist Fred Moten's declaration of the resistance of the object has become ubiquitous, we must also risk its reversal. Moten's focus on the mundane fact that the objectified, specifically enslaved Black people, do resist enables me to explore a trickier, though less fashionable, converse, which is, can objects comply? As such, my interest is with the agency of objects, their ability to choose and reject, to want and not want. In other words, their capacity for desire. Obviously, we are capable of desiring that which does not reciprocate, and we animate objects with the intensity of our fears and desires for them. But can objects want us back? History, myth, and science fiction are rich with stories about such projections and reciprocations of desire and agency. But it is only in the context of technology where that question becomes worth taking seriously. And it is the history of race that makes it possible to answer it literally, because the meanings of bodies are informed and shaped by a logic of embodiment that is deeply racialized and most certainly gendered. I'm talking, of course, of anthropomorphism, which is a drive older even than modernity, but during industrialism and chattel slavery in the 19th century, distinct traditions of representation involving race, sex, and machines would begin to formally intersect. It is in fact that context of industrialism and chattel slavery where the rhetoric and legal parameters of personhood would help make legible the historical and material relationships between Black bodies and machines. In other words, because Black people were framed in an intimate relationship with technology as mindless automatons or forms of prosthetic labor, it would also become inevitable that the political desires and aspirations of the former race, Black people, would inform narratives of the latter, machines. As I've pointed out a number of times in my work, the most notable example of this would be Czech playwright Karel Čapek's great 1920 play, RUR, Rossum's Universal Robots, which introduces the word robot into the English language from a root word meaning coerced labor or drudgery, essentially slavery. That the play is also about a slave rebellion against human masters should never be forgotten in any conversation about the intersections of race and technology. After all, the primary question of whether objects are capable of desire is made possible only by recognizing that the Black slave as an object prefigures other types of objects that would emerge within the rhetoric of bodies, race, and technology. Figures like the robot, for example, become also ensnared in the rhetoric of desire, particularly a desire for agency or autonomy, if not freedom. This is precisely why the very drive to manufacture a future in the West, one that depends on bodies and labor while promising escape from bodies and labor, continues to ensnare technology in the problems of the recent past. It is why metaphors of race, sex, and reproduction are likely to entangle us forever in the material problems of imagining and inventing a future. Old others condition our relationship to new others. Old bodies set the terms by which we make sense of new ones, politically, socially, and even sexually. These historical intersections can be contemporized much easier if we consider a particular kind of artificial bodies. These are what's called sex robots or companion robots. These machines bring together the past and the future of race, sex, technology, and desire. Because so much of that market is dependent on the quality and sophistication of the doll's ability as an object to represent even the most specific niches of male tastes and desires, the attention to detail, color, texture, and response are fully within traditions of the representation of human form. More importantly, these artificial bodies represent the world of objectile paraphilias, in which human beings form erotic and/or romantic attachment to objects, such as walls, buildings, cars, the Eiffel Tower in one famous case, and in another even more famous case, a corporation. More on that later. Some of these individuals have taken these relationships to court for legal sanction, a practice that is likely to grow as the sophistication of design and programming proceeds at the same rate as our proliferating notions of identity and our concurrent conceptions of desire. By the way, such intimacies between machine and human should remind us all that the talk of cyborgs, human-machine hybrids, that were so prominent in both science fiction and feminist theory a generation or two ago, always imply the methods by which hybrids are made: sex and reproduction. However, the blending of machines and human bodies also evokes and depends on chattel slavery in America and the depersonalization, I call it sometimes denaturing or artificialization, of the enslaved African. Narratives concerning this particular object and its many modes of resistance have also always depended on a rhetoric and politics that would be mimicked and appropriated by Carol Capek's robots, which is the rhetoric and politics of personhood, of autonomy, of freedom. Slave personhood, for example, emerges from chattel slavery due to a black desire to merge with a humanity coded and defined as white. The sexual politics of this merging is made even more explicit in the work of the prominent artificial intelligence expert David Levy, author of the notorious book Love and Sex with Robots. Also a 2016 lecture, Why Not Marry a Robot? Levy's work on human-machine intimacy ranges from AI-powered sexual chatbots to sex robots, but it is paradigmatic of how such machine-human parallels tilt always towards race. In fact, they tilt always inevitably towards miscegenation, particularly where whites historically found legal and cultural ways to merge, blend, mate with black peoples, usually forcibly in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Again, the black people had been rendered soulless and inhuman by the logic of biological science and chattel slavery. They were culturally, but also legally poised in some liminal space between animal and human, but again, also as machines, given their function as figures of mindless, freely exploitable labor. As I've also written before, the history of technology from industrialization to cybernetics, from robotics to AI, is rich with such casual parallels between non-whites and robots, technology and social cultural others. Levy's work is therefore not exceptional in this regard. What is unique about it is that his use of these parallels between machine and non-white bodies emerges not from sculpture or science fiction, but from American law. This is clear in his argument that human-robot marriage will ultimately be legally justified by the history of interracial marriage in America. Since the prohibition of such relationships was ultimately due to the belief that race implied a difference in species or biological status, human versus subhuman, subject versus object, he argues that these prohibitions will soon be culturally outgrown precisely in the way that anti-miscegenation laws and laws against interracial marriage and even same-sex marriage have been. Such an argument is not unfamiliar to those eager to legitimize objectophile paraphilias via the language of intimacy. And this language, of course, masks but still begs the question of the object's ability to consent or its capacity to reciprocate. Were Levy to dig a little deeper into American history, he would discover that interracial marriage is not actually the primary legal precedent or justification for human-robot sex and love. That attempt to legitimize the merging of flesh and fabrication depends on something much more foundational, which explicitly paves the way for the border crossing he's talking about. This is yet another set of laws where consent, resistance, and reciprocation between subject and object become weaponized by large economic institutions. And that thing is what we know as corporate personhood. Anti-corporate activist William P. Myers famously wrote, "Slavery is the legal fiction that a person is property. Corporate personhood is the legal fiction that property is a person." Well, both of these legal fictions emerged from the very same place, the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. This amendment was a product of a desire and struggle for political enfranchisement and a significant moment for the recognition of African American personhood. Where the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in the United States, the 14th Amendment, adopted in 1868, affirmed equal protection under U.S. laws for African Americans, as well as granted citizenship rights to former slaves in the wake of the Civil War. It erased the notorious Dred Scott decision from 1857 that held that those descended from African slaves were ineligible for American citizenship, and it paved the way for the 15th Amendment in 1870 that gave black males the right to vote. But here's where it gets interesting. Due to the notion that blacks were not quite or fully human, as well as a great many social and cultural forces attempting to maintain racial hierarchy, like an enormous upsurge in racial violence in the wake of the Reconstruction era, the era of the birth of the Ku Klux Klan, the Supreme Court made clear that the 13th through 15th Amendments were specifically for the freedom of the African race, the security and perpetuation of that freedom, and their protection from the oppression of the white men who had formerly held them in slavery. That last bit is a quote from the Supreme Court. Despite this codicil, the court was unable to avoid the surprising elasticizing of personhood embarked upon by the Southern Pacific Railroad in 1881. The railroad argued that special taxes on railroad property in California discriminated against it specifically under the 14th Amendment. Apparently, the law's protection of black bodies could now be manipulated to address corporate bodies, since the very definition of person could now be challenged in the wake of its application to those who were previously inhuman or only marginally seen as legal persons. In 1882, the railroad deceptively yet successfully argued that the drafters of the 14th Amendment had replaced citizens with persons in order to account for artificial persons as well as natural persons. That personhood could be a state construct was clearly a product of chattel slavery, and the 14th Amendment attempted to rectify that primal dehumanization of Africans. In the context of law, however, it rendered personhood far more fluid than nature or history had previously allowed. This redefinition of personhood would benefit corporations far more than those it initially intended to benefit, because by 1896, the court legalized segregation via Jim Crow laws with the notorious Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal doctrine, whilst corporate culture would only expand its economic and political influence via that same logic of artificial personhood. Corporations were now rendered as people, complete with the rights and protections of individuals. This specific history is why I insist we pay more attention to the material structures of personhood instead of the always vague notion of the human or humanity. The latter term, human, has always been parsimoniously applied to non-whites, and in some cases violently withdrawn. And the desire for freedom or autonomy has always been framed in relationship to it, even in narratives of technology. Personhood has a much more legible history than the human, certainly in sexual and racial terms. As a category, it has been more socially flexible and legally mutable in its differential application to distinct bodies, and it is therefore necessary in any attempt to explain or provide a history for the anthropomorphism at work in new forms of desire or embodiment, such as sex robots and companion robots. So in conclusion, Levy's thinking about human-machine intimacy should be acknowledged as an anticipatory expansion of the category of personhood that is now engaging an emerging technological context. This expansion is in conversation with both the growing market for sex robots, as well as current legal maneuverings in the world of technology, where anticipatory ethical standards around algorithms and semi-autonomous machines have become a pressing concern. This ranges from the AI-based tech used in surgery to self-driving cars, drone warfare. The EU's 2016 proposition of the category of electronic persons, for example, frames such persons not as slaves, as was the assumption in that old rhetoric of human-machine interaction that actually even preceded Karel Capek's RUR. Instead, these kinds of artificial persons are taxable, liable semi-subjects possessing of certain rights, obligations, and liabilities. They become closer to human in that they have the right to resist or comply, accept or reject, regardless of their current capacity to literally do so. These, of course, are legal arguments, but these arguments can be made on behalf of such persons to protect their interests. We see this happening in environmental struggles where certain natural bodies, lakes, valleys, streams, are being given rights so they can be defended by other groups and individuals on their behalf, right? Anyway, this is all important in my thinking about the development of technology, because to know who or what can or will become human or admitted into the category of personhood simply requires that we look at the history of this promiscuous category. Now, of course, the kind of personhood being discussed in the contemporary context of machine intelligence is nearly as ethically fraught and economically complex as were the conversations around blacks during chattel slavery. For example, it is threatening to companies who worry about producing a commodity they cannot sell for fear of being charged with some sort of trafficking, or the ethical and legal complexities of ownership and profit when dealing with machines that have rights. Even manufacturers of sex robots or companion robots are confronting these anticipatory ethical standards, as well as organized resistance in which artificial bodies are being held liable to their impact on the bodies of real women, especially if it is the case that these objects cannot comply and are only manufactured to produce a simulacrum of consent and desire. Some might have heard the rumor and the marginal possibility of what they call rape robots, right, that people have been trying to construct, and may have by now, I don't know. Anyway, these concerns should simply alert us to the fact that the tensions and struggles for and against corporate and electronic forms of personhood, as well as those between machines and human bodies, promises to shape much of our future. And because these mutable notions of being are so deeply implicated in the histories of race and gender, these struggles will be central also to a future shaped by the expansion of self and other beyond the differences between human and machine, an expansion that will be fueled as much by technology and capital as by desire. Thank you.